Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
So, are you still in Idaho, or are you
Yep.
staying in Idaho?
Yeah. Pocatello, Idaho, the southeast corner. And yeah, been here for 28 years.
Wow. I was born in British Columbia, so we used to vacation to Idaho in the
Pro-
summertime.
Yeah, probably northern, but
Yes.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
Idaho has lots of different faces. It's quite a diverse geography.
Really?
Yeah, so the Panhandle is thick Douglas fir forests and beautiful lakes. You get down in the center, it's the Idaho batholith. It's rocky and craggy and getting drier. And then you get down to the southern, and it's the Snake River Plain, that kind of pathway through the Rockies that the pioneers used, but it's sagebrush steppe. It's desert, upland desert. So it's a lot of different faces.
That's interesting. So, is that where all the farming takes place in the southern part of the state?
That's right. Yeah, that's famous for the potatoes because of the very silty soil. All that glacial loess
Mm.
makes good potatoes and sugar beets and lots of those root crops.
So, can you get that locally sourced at like a farmer's market pretty easily, or
Oh
it's a
yeah, oh yeah. In fact, if you're really into it, you can go and glean the fields after they've harvested the potatoes. We had a couple of friends who used to. That was a family project, and they would take bushels, baskets of gleaned potatoes around to all their friends and neighbors and people in need. And so you'd have a, we'd eat nothing but potatoes for a week so they wouldn't, you know, so they don't go bad in the house. We don't have a root cellar to keep them in.
right, right. That's interesting, though. That's always my favorite because I'm from the Midwest, originally from Nebraska, and like that was always my favorite part of the year around harvest time when you got all the everything in, and I don't know, and just sitting around and eating it. It was
Oh yeah. Well, and everything's fresh, it's, I mean, not that it's not fresh, but I mean, when you get produce from distant locations, they're usually picked before they're at their prime and ripen, and the trucks come in. But so cantaloupes and apples, and they just don't taste the same out of season as when you can go down and get them just after they've been picked off the tree. Tomatoes, right off the vine. There's nothing to compare.
nothing better than that for sure.
That's
So I guess I'll tell you how I got or how I discovered your work. It was just through the Monster Quest series on the History Channel on YouTube,
right. Hmm.
and the most interesting uh, or the most interesting documentary was when you went up to Ontario.
Right.
I think that was the one that really, I think it provided the most evidence.
Yeah. Left a few, dangling participles, but that was an intriguing experience.
So where at in Ontario was that?
It was, I could point to it on a map, but it was about a third of the way up from the southern border. The Our departure point was just over the Canadian border from is it Minnesota or Wisconsin, and and then we took a float plane trip. It was a good 45 minutes, hour-long float plane flight up to that lake, and so I mean they're trying to pick out landmarks. It was really an eye opener to fly over that country, because you would look down and it was just a checkerboard of lakes. There
Mm.
was almost more water than land, and there was no possibility to hike in a straight line for more than a mile before you had to circumvent around a body of water. And then it was just amazing terrain to be up there. These very shallow, oftentimes very shallow lakes up there on the Canadian Shield, and rugged rocky terrain with very thin soils, but kind of stunted forest, lots of moss growing on everything, and it was sort of treacherous going to hike. The portage trails between lakes were well established, but if you went off on your own. You had to watch your step because you could step in a moss or fern obscured crevice and break a leg with little effort.
That's really interesting. I've been up there once before, and if there's one place where a Bigfoot could exist, I think that would be the place because it's so isolated and densely forested.
Yeah, and a lot that can be said for a lot of the terrain across central and northern Canada. The boreal forest is spreading across there. I mean, a little bit of interruption as the Great Plains project up a ways into there, but most of the Canadian population kind of hugs that southern border.
Southern, right? Yeah, southern Canada. Because I was born in southern Canada, and
Right.
it's just so silly because yeah, it's not really southern, but yeah,
No,
yeah,
but yeah, the population's kind of concentrated, and there's just lots of area where there are very few. I mean, there are people out there. I mean, you're making a living out there, some still, but the whatever the statistic is, the number of people per square mile, I mean, is probably less than one. I know it's less than one in a lot of that terrain. So yeah, it's a vast area.
So how did you get started in your research on Sasquatch?
Well, I get asked that frequently, and I always try to think of a new way to answer it. There really isn't. I mean, I must say I was introduced to Sasquatch at a young age. I was about 11 years old when Roger Patterson actually came through Spokane with his documentary showcasing that 60 seconds of film footage, and that was my first exposure to a Bigfoot, to the term Bigfoot. Sasquatch came a little bit later when I was introduced to John Green's books and a fellow Canadian, and that planted the seed. I mean, I was already as a youngster was interested in all things relating to natural history and evolution, anthropology, cavemen, prehistoric life, so forth, and this just dovetailed with those interests and reinforced them, and that interest waxed and waned as you could expect in a young person's life. I can't say that I decided then that I was going to become a Bigfoot researcher, but I was really engrossed by the subject matter and was well read and spent a lot of time collecting clippings. In the day before Google, spending time poking through the library shelves, books about strange and unusual phenomenon, travel tales by explorers, the Himalayan mountaineers, accounts of the Yeti footprints, and so on, and then eventually, I pursued a career that just put me in a position where the stars kind of aligned in a way. I guess you could describe it that way. But I ended up pursuing a career in anatomical sciences with an emphasis in physical anthropology. So I teach human anatomy in the health professions programs, and then do research on specifically the evolution of primate generally, but specifically human locomotion, our habit of walking on two legs in particular. So the lower extremity in the foot, the business end of that of those appendages, and footprints. Obviously, the Laetoli hominid footprints are an iconic example of the very rare data that we have in the form of direct evidence, well, or indirect evidence. I guess it's direct evidence of the behavior, indirect evidence of the anatomy, which go hand in hand. And so, with that career, then at one point, some circumstances revived that interest, that kind of latent interest in Sasquatch, when the opportunity presented itself to actually evaluate some footprint evidence and some video evidence of an alleged encounter with the Sasquatch down in Northern California, not too far from where the Patterson Gimlin film was shot. And that just sort of set the ball rolling. I mean, here was a question of science. Are there relic hominoids? Is there a biological species behind the legend of Bigfoot or Sasquatch? And I was in, the fact that footprints constituted by far the most compelling evidence, in many ways, the most objective. I was in an extraordinary position to make a contribution, to participate in the wrangling with that question on that level. And so that's what pulled me in, seeing 15-inch tracks in the ground, a remarkable case, remarkable example. Now I have well over 300 footprint casts in the laboratory, and have looked at examples from other potential relic hominoids like the almas, the Russian almas, the Chinese Yeren, the examples of footprints attributed to the Yeti, and so on. So yeah, it's been an amazing journey. We haven't reached the destination yet, that being the actual acknowledgement or establishment of the existence through a physical specimen yet. But I think that's just in some cases just a matter of time.
So why do you think that we don't have a physical specimen at this point?
Well, I think the basis, the common denominator for that question in all these cases is they're extremely rare. I mean, they are relic hominoids. That is, they don't exist in numbers that they may have in the past, or have as wide a distribution as they might have in the past. And that rarity and other aspects of their natural history and anatomy and behavior. I mean, they're a large-bodied, long-lived, solitary, possibly to some extent nocturnal, far-ranging, generalized omnivore. And when you link all of those things into one package, plus intelligent, at least as smart as a chimp or a gorilla, if not more so, you roll all those things into one package, and that makes for, you can talk to any collector or hunter of rare and elusive species. Those are all the qualities that define that category. And so the odds are stacked against you right from the get-go. And then you combine with that the fact that there are very few people who are seriously and in a well-equipped, systematic manner searching for these creatures. You can point to all the weekend warriors and so forth and enthusiasts you want, but there's only a limited realistic expectation of success from as far as the ultimate. I mean, I recognize and am grateful for the evidence, the data, the experiences that are shared with me by those very people who are out there multiplying the eyes and ears and so forth in the field, which is absolutely essential, I think, for any serious search for this creature. But having said that, the professionals, the agency personnel, the academic research scientists, conservationists, they're not looking for this creature, and so it's kind of unrealistic to expect success when no one's doing the work, or doing the actual searching.
So with all those odds stacked against you as far as the rarity of the creature, does that change how you study it scientifically, or is it still the same scientific method?
Well, it imposes a certain number of particular parameters, I guess you'd say. I still think, the same rigors of science. When we talk of when I encourage citizen scientists, enthusiasts to try to conduct themselves scientifically. I mean, what does that mean? Well, objectivity is probably number one, that you can objectively evaluate the evidence without your own subjective expectations or wishes, hopes. Sometimes people see what they want to see or anticipate seeing. This is where parsimony comes in. I'm a strong antagonist regarding the misuse, the abuse of the term parsimony in science, because it's often misused and mislabeled. Parsimony doesn't suggest that the simplest explanation is more likely to be true, but parsimony in this setting is very applicable. Parsimony suggests that you're not justified to elaborate your hypothesis prematurely. Occam, when he said, Occam's razor was basically saying that one shouldn't unnecessarily multiply factors, because in the philosophy of science, and sometimes ideological skeptics use this as one of the litmus tests. Science proceeds by refutation, not by confirmation, and philosophically that may hold water, but in practicality it's not really the way most scientists conduct work. But philosophically, what the historians of science and philosophers of science were saying is it's impossible to test every case. So you're really not justified to marshal affirmative examples and ignore everything else. You should rather look for that one exception that will nullify your hypothesis. That's the simplest way to test your hypothesis. Find a contradiction. So, and then if you find a contradiction, you're then justified to then go back to the drawing board and maybe make a little more elaborate explanation that takes into account that negative evidence and so forth. So the point, what does that mean? Well, when someone's out walking through the woods and they find a footprint and there's 5 toes, well, the first thing they should ask is, what other animal, what more common animal that I might be more likely to find would leave a flat-footed footprint with 5 toes? Well, it's a bear. So before you jump to the conclusion this must be a Sasquatch, you have to eliminate or falsify the hypothesis that it's a bear footprint.
Well, they trail their feet too, so it can look big.
Well, right, exactly. There's all kinds of things, but that's the point. When I'm constantly dealing with, and when I say dealing with, I'm interacting with, and hopefully in a positive way. People are sending their photos and examples of evidence to me, and so we kind of work through this process together and say, all right, now are we justified in thinking this might be Sasquatch or not? So that's one way, and then other aspects of scientific methodology. Are we approaching it empirically? Are we using are we substantiating our hypotheses with data? And that doesn't necessarily have to be experimental, but rather it can be observational. We collect data. We have imagery. We have trace evidence, footprints. We have physical evidence in the form of scat or hair, and then subject those things to critical evaluation. And one element of good science is peer review. So again, that's why I welcome people to bring things. You need to be able to subject your evidence to scrutiny, and you need to be able to be detached from it a little bit. This is one of the challenges that non-scientists have, is they've got this evidence, and for them that's their gold ticket to participating in the search for Sasquatch. And if you question that, you're taking away their membership card, essentially, or at least they interpret it that way, which they shouldn't. I mean, they shouldn't take it as a personal attack. It needn't be, unless you behave inappropriately, and conduct yourself less than commendably, but or less than scientifically. But it's that self-correcting principle, which is in large measure comes through, in part through peer review, holding your evidence up to scrutiny. Now, peer review is not perfect by any means. I mean, and you can find all kinds of literature that bemoans the shortcomings, the politics and egos and so forth that get in the way of good peer review functioning. But it's what we have to work with, and in principle, I think it's an effective tool to help sharpen your skills as a critical thinker and objective scientist, objective investigator, let's say, even if you're not a bona fide professional credentialed scientist, you can still aspire to the guiding principles of scientific investigation.
So do you find yourself teaching people these skills?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I get emails from people on almost a daily basis, sharing different experiences or different evidences. A couple of cases of footprints a week is not uncommon at all. And as it goes, many times those are quite readily identifiable, attributable to other more common explanations. Like my example of the bear track was offered because that's a very common, frequent experience, and it just takes a little practice, a little training and experience, and you too can be an expert in bear tracks, and the differences between a bear track and a supposed or not Yeti, but a Sasquatch, Yeti as well. I mean, bear tracks and Yeti tracks are conflated repeatedly as well. I mean, this is a kind of a broad, sweeping problem or issue that we deal with in sifting through, the evidence for any one of these relic hominoids, because quite frequently the habitat that would support a large omnivorous primate of one stripe or another potentially would also likely support a bear population. And so there's that potential. You've got that, quote, look-alike. Doesn't look really that much alike, but at least it approximates in some ways. They're able to stand upright. They walk more on the flats of their feet, but they have 4 feet, if you will, 4 paws, 2 hands and 2 feet on the ground, and a quadrupedal trackway is often readily discernible. But that habit of sometimes at proper speed placing the hind foot on or in the adjacent to the forepaw can sometimes give the appearance of a bipedal trackway, especially in snow, where then melt can obliterate some of those details and give a further impression of a bipedal pattern to the trackway in snow.
Well, this is a little off topic, but since you mentioned snow, do you think that these creatures hibernate, or are they active all year round?
It's a good question, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, I have some thoughts. I haven't even come to a conclusion, but certainly activity drops off, and especially when you consider that it should be, it's a give and take. It should be easier to see footprint sign, but on the other hand, we get out less in the wintertime unless you're cross-country skiing or snowmobiling or snowshoeing in the backcountry. You're less likely to see those tracks unless it's crossing a road, adjacent to a road, or so on. So it's hard to know if activity really is dropping off, or maybe it's just curtailed to narrower regions of activity. I do sort of think that there's a good chance that they do hole up and are inactive, at least, if not hibernating, for extended periods of time. I think that there's good evidence for a genetic basis for that kind of behavior having evolved, and even in a large ape under these environmental circumstances. There's other examples like that we can point to, like bears, which aren't really true hibernators. I mean, this is the thing. We use the term hibernation, but if you look amongst mammals, sleeping in the winter or periods of inactivity has evolved in multiple different ways in different lineages of mammals. And bears are one example, and then they're a good example because in a number of ways, because, when people say, oh, there are no primates that hibernate. Well, if you didn't know about bears, you could say, oh, well, there are no carnivores that hibernate. Bears are the only carnivores of the order Carnivora that hibernate. And so it is possible for a lineage in an order to evolve a novel behavior, a novel physiology. So you don't, just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean they can't necessarily, doesn't mean that it can't exist. Now, in some cases, in this case, it's clearly within the realm of possibility. And even humans, even the human genome we've identified, or it has been identified, but others have identified those genes that are homologs to the genes in hibernating mammals. And in humans, they are involved in sleep cycles, circadian rhythms, serotonin production. There was an article not too long ago that suggested that evidence in the skeletal remains of Neanderthals suggested that they might even hibernate, or at least have periods of inactivity. When you consider the habitat that they occupied, it was a pretty rigorous, inhospitable habitat, that periglacial environment, and especially in the wintertime. I mean, it was it's interesting, and since we got onto that, I always find that it's interesting how people in public media and so forth, they tend to kind of gloss over things, and especially if there's a political motivation. And in this age of inclusivity and so forth, Neanderthals they're one of us. They're human, and so they're painted. The pendulum swings to the extreme as far as human characteristics, and yet there's a lot of clues. Every time someone finds a fox tooth with a hole bored through it, oh, look at this! Neanderthals were capable of art and expression. And all right, well, yeah, there was recently. That was what it was. Recently, there was a horse's hoof, the ungule, the bone, that had a few crosshatches kind of carved into it, and you would have thought it was the Mona Lisa, the way they were going on about this artistic expression. I'm thinking, my goodness, a kindergartner could come up with a better effort than that. And when you look at some of the literature that shows, for example, documentation of occupation sites of Neanderthals over millennia, and there were periods that probably represent hundreds, if not thousands of years, there's no evidence of fire use at all. And there are other studies that have shown through stable isotope analysis, of the teeth and bones, that at least that individual had a diet that was 100% meat. So if you combine those two, you have a species that's capable of surviving on 100% raw meat. That's pretty interesting.
Oh, that is weird.
Raw, because there's no evidence of fire, and so the evidence of clothing is very minuscule. There's no evidence of like bone needles that you get in the Neolithic with Homo sapiens. So stitched clothing, fitted, tailored clothing. So we're talking about wraps, and that's it. No mittens, no mucklucks, no nothing. And yet they're surviving in this kind of an environment. And so, not to mention the fact that as a species, they, all this to do about a little bit of gene introgression between populations, which seems to be a one-way introgression from them to us. No evidence from us to them. And yet, despite all the, we were just one big happy family interbreeding all the time, it was obviously very rare, very isolated. The actual introgression, the actual cross-pollinating, if you will, or insemination, the introgression takes place then down the road, does not represent repeated conjugal visits. it's the proliferation and spread of that gene within the population after the fact. And so, but the point being that for what, 30, 40,000 years, these two types lived right next to each other, sometimes even essentially on the same metaphorical block of the street, and yet they remained different from one another. So that even, 20,000 years later, after initial contact, you could still find a Neanderthal skull and a Homo sapiens skull, and they were different and distinct. There was no rampant hybridization. I mean, these are important things that, and I, I don't mean to go off on a tilt here, but they also, that scenario, that treatment of that topic directly impacts the perception and the interpretation of the prospect of relic hominoids, like the Almas, a relic Neanderthal population, perhaps, or maybe Denisovan, or a relic giant ape, or giant hominin like Sasquatch or the Yeren. These things, the misrepresentation and storytelling in anthropology really does have an influence on establishing paradigms, ways of thinking against which the prospect and alleged data of Bigfoot is held up to as a standard. Anyway.
So I'm guessing that you got some resistance from your colleagues over the years.
Well, did you hear that in my voice? Oh, of course. Yeah, I mean, anytime there's a unconventional, unorthodox proposition, it meets with some resistance. I mean, science is notoriously, the scientific community, let's make a distinction there. The scientific community is notoriously conservative, and it has served it well in that respect, but it can be taken to an extreme to the point that it becomes a handicap rather than an advantage. And it spans the gambit. I mean, on one level, this topic is simply guilty by association. So it's lumped in with the tabloid. It's branded as pseudoscience, and justified or not. And I don't want to be guilty of the reverse kind of generalization. I mean, sure, there's justification for criticism, because I mean, there's a lot of different types of people active in the search for a lot of different things get put out there in social media and so forth. There are very few serious scientists who are perhaps a little bit more grounded. Not the only ones, but I mean, certainly they're at that pole. But there's also a more fundamental resistance, and in that it is perceived as going against conventional wisdom. I mean, they can't exist. And every science has its paradigms. Paradigm literally means to display alongside, para alongside, and dime is, denotes displaying or viewing. And so what that means is science has its standards. It has its set of ideas against which new ideas are compared. And so in anthropology, for a long time, and I've developed this narrative, but for a long time, I wondered, why was there such a reaction, such a visceral rejection of the subject? This even the prospect of entertaining the possibility that something might be out there. I mean, the film, the Patterson-Gimlin film, which sort of becomes an iconic representation of this proposition, it was viewed by a panel of scientists. I mean, at least they opened the door to the possibility, but it was essentially a foregone conclusion what their opinion of it was going to be. I mean, and that was clear based on some of the remarks that were made after the fact. I mean, some even being honest enough to acknowledge their inability to really nail down why they rejected it. Nevertheless, they did. And then some silly explanation, some silly rationale was provided. And I say that, I don't mean that facetiously or say that lightly. Some of the things that were said about the film, even at the time, were silly. Were just downright silly and embarrassing as an anthropologist to acknowledge that my colleagues would tout such a point of view. I mean, like the hairy breasts, for example, is a favorite one, where the one individual thought it quite amusing that here was this hulking male-like creature with sporting these ample pendulous breasts that were no less hair covered. And of course, everyone knows that primates have essentially hairless breasts. Well, no, everyone doesn't know that, and most experts don't even acknowledge that. And all you have to do is look. Even humans, as hairless as we are, I point out that if there is a goose bump, if you have goose flesh, each of those little bumps, those little pimples, goose pimples, is produced by the contraction of an erector pili muscle that is attached to a remnant hair follicle there, even if the hair is extremely fine or is absent, essentially. There's still the evidence of that. And, all you have to do is look. But if you just look at other non-human primates, chimps, gorillas, and so forth, and there's hair. It may be sparse in some species, but there are hair follicles, or it may be fine. And so to see a primate species with the breasts clearly covered with hair is not, contraindicated by conventional wisdom. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing. But even more fundamental than that, perhaps, you take it in one step even deeper. It occurred to me as I was reflecting, and I've learned this with many other topics, to really understand how things got to where they are. You have to understand the history. You have to consider the inception of ideas that may seem out of place or may seem indefensible now, but at the time of their inception, against the backdrop of ideas at the time, they make perfect sense suddenly. And so if you go back to the mid-60s, well, what was happening in anthropology? Well, there was an idea afoot that had been proposed that, and it was also partly politically driven, I'm convinced, this idea of extending the net as far as possible to encompass all of these hominin species under the label of humanity. I mean, we've been human since the beginning, basically, just changing species, changing through time and in response to changing circumstances. But we're all human, basically. Well, the idea actually, it goes back even further. Back in the 30s, there was a Russian microbiologist who discovered that as he was growing his microbes and studying them, you could grow, say, one species of paramecium in a medium, and it was a happy camper, and it thrived. You could grow another species of paramecium in that exact same medium, and it also thrived. But put the two together in the same petri dish, in the exact same media, and one of them thrived, and the other one went crashing down and became extinct, was outcompeted by the other. And this became known as the principle of competitive exclusion. Species do compete for limited resources and survival, and one's going to be able to do it better. So either one will go extinct, or there will be, and this is where then that principle kind of carried over into the new discipline of ecology in the middle of the last century, especially, as it was burgeoning. And the niche concept was a central paradigm of ecology. No two species can occupy the same niche. Well, anthropology, as it was kind of casting about for more interdisciplinary influences and integrating ideas from other disciplines, this niche concept was applied to humans. Well, let's see. Hominid niche is pretty unusual. bipedalism, braininess, and above all, culture, a culture-bearing species. There can be only one species in that niche. So human evolution was seen as this single file march, one species giving rise to another, supplanting it, but always just one. And this led to all kinds of things, and I won't go into all the details of it here, but the ruminations back and forth, and basically the can was just continually kicked down the road. Well, I guess I have to. So at first there was, when I was a youngster, and you would, if you opened up your Time Life Nature Library book, one of the good sources of that time, again before the internet, there were arguments about whether we were talking about one or two species of Australopithecine. And some were arguing, well, they were just males and females. The big robust ones with the sagittal crests and big jaws, they were the males, and the more petite ones, the more gracile ones, were the females. Eventually that fell to the wayside as it became clear, as the fossil record increased in diversity and number, there were different kinds of Australopithecines living side by side. Well, they're just bipedal chimpanzees. They're not really human yet. So not till the emergence of Homo. So we'll kick the can down till we get to Homo. Once you get to Homo, though, and tool use, there's that culture, then there can be only one species. Well, no longer, the echo was just dying out when Richard Leakey publishes, and they had Homo erectus, or now we call it Homo ergaster, Homo rudolfensis, Homo habilis, and robust Australopithecines, all living side by side in East Africa. And so boom, well, let's kick the can further down. Once we get to the emergence of Homo sapiens, then there can be only one, and that we're the last one. Then all other hominins are extinct. Well, then they find the hobbit, Homo floresiensis, in Indonesia. And at first the dates were a mere 13,000 years, 13 to 18,000 years for those fossils. They since kind of kicked them back a little bit. But as the discoveries of other hominins have increased, they just had a fishing trawler off the coast of Taiwan pull a fossil jaw out of their net that was at least that's how it was made the press. I don't know if there's been any refinement of that, but estimated to be possibly as young as 10,000 years, a Homo erectus jaw, 10,000 years ago. There's been, I had the privilege of examining a fossil specimen called the Jinyu Shan hominin that was an archaic species of Homo called, under the rubric of Homo heidelbergensis. It's actually very closely related to this new Harbin human, the dragon man that was just recently discovered. And only this specimen, the Jinyu Shan, has estimated dates of 12 to 20,000 years ago. We've got Neanderthal sites. That most books you'll see, if you open up, it'll say about 32,000 years for the extinction of Neanderthals. But there are some occupation sites that have dates as potentially as young as 10,000 years that just haven't been widely publicized yet. I mean, so 10 to 20,000 years ago, you could go back in a time machine, step out and bump into any of a half a dozen different hominins running around the landscape. So why would it be different now? Why did they all suddenly go extinct just 10,000 years ago? I mean, is it really realistic to assume that, especially in the face? I mean, if all else was equal, then maybe you could sit on that opinion. But in the face of so much evidence that suggests that there are relic hominoids, so much so that not too many years ago, New Scientist, British popular, semi-technical science magazine, had a cover story entitled "The Top 10 Questions Facing Human Evolution Today." And number 9, are other hominins alive today? So at least that editorial board, or whoever that body of individuals made those decisions about what to include in the top 10, acknowledged that, hey, there's something interesting about these allegations of persistent populations of other hominins around the world. Maybe we should be taking a look at this. And especially, our tree just gets bushier and bushier, and more evidence of some of these branches persisting until very recent dates. Who knows? Who knows where it'll end up?
Well, that was a very interesting explanation. So what was the last great ape to exist on Earth then?
Well, the last great ape or the last hominin?
Hominid.
Okay, yeah, the last hominid species. Well, I just kind of plugged some of those dates. This recent discovery of the Harbin man, the Dragon Man, the estimates on that are, although we don't have good provenience, and so I'm not sure. I didn't look past the headline on that date, but they had it listed as 146,000 years ago, which is still pretty recent. I mean, especially when you think about Homo sapiens emerged as early as 300,000 years ago. Current dates are placing it. So that means there was another hominin on the landscape when our species was here. And of course, Neanderthals persisted until at least 30,000 years ago, maybe as recently as 10 to 20. We have the Hobbit, a small diminutive, possibly a late Australopithecine, early Homo habilis type. Habiline might be the term, that was there to 50,000 years ago, if not less. Homo erectus 10,000 years ago, if that jaw off Taiwan is indeed Homo erectus. It sure was not modern Homo sapiens. I mean, the large teeth and receding mandible with no mental eminence, no prominent chin on there that's so typical of our species. So, you don't have to go back very far, and that's just the fossil record. See, that's the other thing to always bear in mind. What are the odds that jaw of that Homo erectus pulled up in the fisherman's net was the last Homo erectus to live and die? It's pretty slim.
Yeah.
So fossils, the existing fossils probably don't bracket the first appearance and last appearance of the species. It's in there somewhere, but everyone acknowledges, whether they'll say it or not publicly, that there could easily have been, a Homo erectus then that was maybe 5,000 years old.
Well, there are also vast areas of land that were available to human beings and other Homo or apes, I guess you could call them. I don't know what the scientific term is, but during the Ice Age, because the sea level was so different.
Well, true.
So
yeah.
A lot of that is lost to the sea now.
A lot of the, there certainly are areas where where the fossil record is now inundated with seawater. You're right. So our ability to sample those periods of time is handicapped, is reduced because of the conditions of preservation or lack thereof.
So has there been any fossil evidence of a recent, like a Bigfoot type creature in the fossil record recently?
Well,
that come up.
People point frequently and to one possible candidate, and that's Gigantopithecus blacki, was a giant species in East Asia, and dates the most recent dated fossils attributed to that species are about 300,000 years, the youngest fossil. But you'll, again, acknowledging what we just talked about bracketing, you'll commonly see in the literature figures like could have persisted until 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. So you see that. So, Gigantopithecus is an interesting possibility. Although we have a very limited fossil record, we have just a couple jaws and a few thousand isolated teeth. Not much to go on. We have nothing of the postcranial skeleton. So we don't know one way or the other as to its posture and stature. which depends on limb proportions and so on. But you got something that's the right size in the right place at the right time to have quite readily extended its range into North America. And so it's a reasonable hypothesis, it is. Now others point to bipedalism, and they perceive it as a very singular, very rare adaptation that is unique to the hominin clade, us and our nearest relatives, since our divergence from the last shared common ancestor with the great apes like the chimpanzee. That's a conservative, a very narrow interpretation. Those of us who, spend time in looking at examples of evolution. I mean, one of my favorite topics that I love to discuss with my students, because it's such a insightful perspective on the process of natural selection, is convergence, examples of convergent evolution, where two lineages, unrelated lineages, have converged on a body type or an adaptation that from different starting points, but because of selective forces that have shaped them for that. Some of the textbook examples are a dolphin, a mammal, and a shark, on the one hand. Or you could take, which is a fish, or you could go even further, a reptile like an ichthyosaur. And they all have that same fusiform dorsal body shape, dorsal fin, pectoral fins, a tail with flukes. In the case of the mammal, they're horizontally oriented. In the case of the fish and the reptile, they're vertically oriented, but nevertheless the same principle. They're fascinating, and there's example after example after example. So many so that I think you're on thin ice if you are adamant that bipedalism could only have evolved once in a pre-hominin ancestor. And there have been examples now that are being discussed in the literature. Luzonensis was a Miocene ape that was recently described, which shows evidence of upright posture and bipedalism, perhaps up in the canopy, where it's walking on top of branches and collecting fruit overhead or whatever, but would predispose it. I mean, we're finding that the extreme anatomy of, say, chimps and gorillas, which are just a fraction of the anatomical diversity of the Miocene ape radiation, which had hundreds of species. You can't you can't cast all apes in the mold of a chimp or a gorilla. That our common ancestor actually looked almost as different from the chimp as it did from the human. But the point being that many of these Miocene apes had morphology, say of the pelvis, that predisposed them to upright posture and bipedal walking and standing, much more so than even chimp is capable of. And they're quite, they're facultative. That is, they don't walk habitually, but if their hands are full, they'll, if there are bananas to be carried off away from your neighbor, they can walk bipedally quite adeptly. There's Ambam the gorilla at the London Zoo, who's very good at standing upright and walking bipedally. It's uncanny to watch because he's got these little teeny short legs, which are due to the proportions that these extreme brachiators, climbers, have evolved. But nevertheless, he's capable. So I don't think that bipedalism should be too narrowly applied. Those that do, however, say then that Bigfoot exhibiting bipedalism, and if you accept the Patterson-Gimlin film, there is a remarkably human-like gait. It's not exactly human-like, and there are distinguishing characteristics of it. The high step, the carrying angle of the leg, the proportions of foot to leg length, and so on. The interlimb proportions themselves are outside of human variation, leg to arm ratio. But nevertheless, it walks kind of like we do. So that could have easily evolved convergently. And but I'm sorry, I talking in a circle here. I meant to make the point of the advocate for that being singular. In that case, they point to the hominin radiation for a candidate. Well, the one that strikes me as very interesting and the most compelling argument I could make would be to show you a slide that I prepared where I've got a close-up of Patty, the subject of the Patterson-Gimlin film, with a skull of a robust Australopithecine juxtaposed. And there are some very interesting derived traits, some specialization of this robust Australopithecine, robust in its facial skeleton and size of its jaws and teeth and supporting structures and muscles and so on, muscle attachments, attachment sites. You put that skull up, scale it up and put it beside Patty, and point for point, her facial proportions within and facial to neurocranium are almost identical. I mean, they're clearly poured from the same mold, meaning she has those same hypertrophy of the facial skeleton to support these deep jaws, which could only be there to house really large teeth, and a grinding, chewing mechanism. It's interesting that many witnesses who have seen Sasquatch teeth, claim to have seen Sasquatch teeth, remark about the lack of projecting canines. They have squared off tooth rows, which is an adaptation for side-to-side grinding. If you have interlocking canines, then basically you're limited to open and close gait. Your side-to-side movement is limited, and so one of the reasons some primates have reduced and lost those projecting canines is to allow for that greater side-to-side grinding between these large, puffy-crowned, thick enameled teeth, which I wouldn't be surprised if someone does ever come in with a Sasquatch jaw. That's what we'll find. If you look at a Gigantopithecus jaw, that's what you find. Short canines worn tip to tip, and great big massive teeth with thick enamel, hyper thick enamel. So problem is, so there you've got the right adaptations, bipedalism and these massive jaws in something like a robust Australopithecine, but right now you've got to go to East Africa to find examples, or Southern Africa, but one of the most extreme is in East Africa, and it's thought to have gone extinct, almost 1 million years ago. So how do you get from East Africa to North America, and what happened in that 1 million years? That's a big chunk of the story that's missing. Seems less, for a long time I kind of dismissed it as improbable, but then come back to the Hobbit story. Here you've got what I would call a relic Australopithecine, early habiline. Homo habilis was essentially an Australopithecine that had a brain that was about 20, 30 cc's bigger. That's it. It used to be the cutoff was Homo habilis made tools, and that distinguished it from Australopithecines. Now they've found examples of tool use in Australopithecines, so that boundary disappears. So the next big difference is the jump between habilines and erectines, or Homo ergaster, with a major increase in body size, major jump in brain size, major elaboration in tool use, and so forth. That's the real step. Anyway, so the point being, my point being is that's the mix. Australopithecine, habiline, the pre-erectus, that's the mix that Homo floresiensis emerged from. I think now, I hope, that all the argument that they were insular dwarfs of Homo erectus has been abandoned. The evidence clearly shows they have nothing to do with Homo erectus. And so, again, how do you get this little remnant Australopithecine on the island of Flores in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, 50,000 years ago, when to find another example, you have to go to East Africa 2 million years ago? So again, something's happened along the way between there. There's still a lot of missing storyline, you know. And so just that, I mean, I just point to that, say, hey, we don't know everything. So you're going to tell me Sasquatch can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist? Man, you need to go back and review your own discipline, because you don't understand how little we really understand at this point. You know, anthropologists are great at telling stories, of filling in gaps, glossing over gaps, to tell these, you know, sweeping epic stories of the hero emerging from the forest. I mean, not so much anymore. I mean, it's, I'm I'm a little cynical, obviously, on this side of the fence, I guess. But I'm also on the other side a lot. Spend a lot of time on the other side of the fence. And there's a lot of, I mean, it's a fantastic story. It's such an interesting area of investigation and scientific research. But having said that, you know, that's the thing. When you're involved in a controversial topic like this, you know, it's the controversy that can expose the good and the bad, kind of separates it. Excuse me. And so you encounter people who are open-minded, inquisitive, you know, inquiring, curious individuals, and then you also run into people who are closed-minded, you know, skeptical to a fault, and so have such shallow comprehension of their own discipline that they can't see their, you know, their nose for their face. And so so yeah, the experience is a broad one, but but
So,
see, let me just add on a positive note. You know, because I'm often asked that question about pushback and about this, that, and the other, and that happens, yes. But I do like to balance that by stating that, just as I've tried to point out with that dichotomy, that simplistic dichotomy, is behind the scenes I interact with a lot of people who are open-minded, you know, who have all those virtuous qualities of a good scientist, and but they just don't wear it on their shirt sleeve. And you know, some are understandably protective of their career, their position, and reputation, because of the environment that we're operating in. But I have a lot of positive interaction. I have people who serve as reviewers and commentators on the journal I edit. I interact with people in various settings and conferences and so forth. And sometimes I'll do professional presentations at scientific conferences to tremendous interest and intrigue and enthusiasm. I mean, it's always even there, it's split. But when given the opportunity, there's a lot of interest. There's just such a stigma attached to it, unfortunately, still, that many are reluctant to openly pursue their curiosity.
well, here's more of a conspiratorial angle to it, but I'm going to bring it up anyways because I think it's interesting. So I heard that one of the reasons why at least governments, like the Canadian government and even the National Park Service or the Forestry Department in the United States doesn't look into this, is because they don't want to, if they find it, then it's probably going to be classified as like an endangered species. And so then that could shut down some logging and mining operations
Right.
in the countries.
And that's certainly possible. I have no direct personal experience to substantiate that suggestion, other than analogy. Here in our own state of Idaho, there were reports of wolves that were discredited or dismissed. And then there was a grand reintroduction program that was ramrodded through, and wolves were brought down from Canada and Alaska and whatnot and so forth, and challenged. It was challenged in court, and the courts deemed that this was not done properly, and they had to backtrack a bit. And the excuse was given, well, it's going to be hard to separate the native wolves from the reintroduced wolves, acknowledging that there were native there all along, but they had denied it because if they acknowledged the presence, that would require a management program, and they didn't, and that would require funding, personnel, manpower, and equipment, and so forth, which they didn't have. Same stories. I've been told same stories by with the example of the eastern cougar. It was denied and denied and denied, and even though there was evidence, there was good evidence that they were present, and it was, eventually it became clear that was the reason why it was being denied, is because they were rare, they were infrequently encountered and so forth, but it would require a program. So I could see how that same bureaucracy could be applied, might be applied in this situation. But I've had no direct interaction. The only experiences I've had, and these were actually not direct. I mean, I have talked to a few people in the know in the agencies, but one in particular, a close friend, had an experience where it was clear that the instigation of the suppression came from a particular individual, a mid-management administrator. It wasn't an institutional policy, but this person, had the sense that such things reflected negatively on him, and it can be personal ego or reputation that one's concerned for, or it can also be, and I've had this waved in my face myself, even doing what I do here at a public institution as part of my regular research program. Had individuals say, well, how do you justify you're using public funds? Well, I mean, my office, my computer and that kind of thing, yes, but my research is funded by private foundations, and not even by government funding, for which I'm sometimes criticized on one hand for not having, NSF grants or other public funding sources, but through private foundations or private philanthropists. So that can be another factor that comes into it. I just, it's the experiences that I have had with some agency people, and we've gone to great lengths, my collaborators and I, in some of the regions that we work to establish networks by going and talking to agency people in their offices, providing them with literature, with reprints, with a copy of my book, a map of the area showing all the activity that we've been documenting. And we've been received extremely positively, and with a great deal of interest and enthusiasm and cooperation. I mean, so much so that, for example, there was one region where we were operating where they routinely trained their trail crews in identifying, distinguishing, like we were talking about earlier, bear tracks from possible Sasquatch tracks. And in the case of the latter, they were given training and instruction and practice in executing a footprint cast to document the evidence that they were instructed to collect and share with the home office. And then we were, of course, were on speed dial, I guess, to receive that information. So that says something. So unfortunately, I don't think that's why I think it's kind of that sort of patchiness suggests mid-level management decisions, not institutional policies coming from the top down. So a lot of it just depends on who's who's the district ranger, the district supervisor, district forester, as to what the attitude is. There was just one more quick story. There was a woman over in Oregon, and two fishermen came into her shop and were telling her about these tracks that they'd seen. She was always curious. She'd always kind of poo-pooed it, but these guys seemed to be really kind of impressed with what they saw. So they said, yeah, you should go see. They gave her directions. She went out. Sure enough, there were these footprints. Well, first thing she did was call up the Fish and Game, and they just laughed at her. What you been drinking? Okay, if that's where you're going to be, that's fine. Hangs up the phone. About 10 minutes later, the phone rings. She picks it up, and this very soft voice says, a quiet voice says, hey, if I come out there with the camera, will you show me where those footprints are? And it was a guy in the office who he didn't want the rest of them to hear, but he came out, and he actually brought with him, he had a manila folder that was the unofficial file, and it had reports and other information, newspaper clippings that were added. But when they got a report from an outdoorsman or whatever, hunter, somebody took some notes and they filed it, but they didn't make a formal report. And that's the kind of thing that I think is going on in lots of different places. But it's too bad, and because that information doesn't really benefit anybody beyond that individual or individuals in an office that are gathering it. But it would be very enlightening if we had flies on the walls of all of these agency offices here. I mean, it was interesting. I mean, when it was my friend and colleague John Mindzinski, when we went into some of these offices, and they were kind of cold calls. I mean, we had sent an information packet ahead, and then basically what we did is just spend a couple of days and drove up and hit every regional office we could get to, and tried to call ahead if we knew when to make an appointment. But in some cases, it was all of the staff, and including the office staff, the secretarial staff, would pile into the conference room to hear us describe what we were doing and show them footprint casts and these maps, and give them, there's always at least one copy of the book that was dedicated as an office copy, so that anyone could read it that wanted to. But the level of interest was extremely high and acute in many of these situations. And they weren't just, they were really interested. It wasn't just, now we can get off for an hour here and just go watch the clowns from talk about Bigfoot. They were really serious and had good penetrating questions and comments, and shared data with us. One of the best footprint reports came from one of those contacts that we made. And because we had done that, when this came across his desk, he picked up the phone and called us, and amazing set of 16-inch footprints. So
when you were in Ontario,
right,
and you were getting rocks at the hut, what was going through your head? Like, was that staged for TV, or was that actually real?
No, that was real. That was real.
Okay.
We were in this remote location.
Right.
And there was no one else for hundreds of miles around us, I'm quite confident. And but anyway, we would routinely stay up late, and there was a big culvert set in as a fire pit, and it stuck up, around. But we'd get a nice bonfire going and stay up quite late. Sometimes when the night was really still, that lake was like glass, you could hear a deer bark on the other side of the lake. It's a good mile away, and it's like it was standing right next to us. It's just the sound would carry. It was just amazing. And you could hear things, night hawks and so forth. And we heard some vocalizations, these trailing screams, and whatnot. But that this one night, I'm not, especially back then, I'm not a night owl at all. And so I was getting kind of punchy And I thought, well, I'm just going to go in. I mean, it was like 1 o'clock in the morning now. And I said, I'm going to go in and just splash some water in my face otherwise I'm going to fall asleep and fall into the fire. And so I went in the house and was doing that, splashing some water on my face and just stretching my legs. And the one kid was out on the porch, the son of our producer director. And it was like someone shot a BB gun against the metal siding, this corrugated steel siding on the house, on the cabin. And man, this kid's eyes were the size of saucers. It really startled him because it was right next to where he was standing, taking a leak off the porch into the bushes. And I when I came out behind him, he was running over to the fire, and I came out behind him. And he's told them already what's happened, and they look at me. Did you hear it? I said, well, yeah, I heard it. And I looked at each of them in the face. I said, so which one of you did it? Which one of you threw a rock? Oh, no, it wasn't us. And I was just testing them to see. I mean, I was confident there was nobody there. I mean, they were all out. There's only so many of us. They were all accounted for. But then, as things progressed, that's when one of the fellas decided he was going to throw a rock into the woods in the direction. We kept hearing some brush pop and some sounds, some suspicious sounds, but it could have been anything. It could have been a deer. It could have been a grouse. There were blue grouse up there. And they when they snuffle through the undergrowth, they sound like an elephant sometimes. But anyway, I jokingly said, don't throw anything too big. He may pick it up and throw it back at you. So we all kind of laughed. And he reached down and picked up, it was about a golf ball size rock. And off he throws it, and you could hear it bounce off the tree trunks in the darkness. Nothing happened. So we're all kind of still just chatting, and our attentions turned away from there, and we're standing around the fire. I happened to be on the opposite side, so a movement just caught my eye, and I looked up just in time to see this rock arcing into the sort of the light from the fire onto the roof of the cabin, and with a resounding bangity bang across that tin roof. And that was not staged. That really happened. So you can second guess, you can wonder if there was a plant up there that had come in before us 5 days earlier and had remained undetected for 5 days, just off in the wings in order to pull this off. Well, if that were the case, I think I would have had the cameras rolling at the time, which they didn't. The cameras were rolling once we went back into the cabin. And so I'm quite confident that it happened. Then you have to ask, well, what could throw a rock like that? I mean, unless a bear has sprouted a thumb, I don't think a bear's going to throw anything else. I mean, this was not just, it was a high arcing, and it was just to get our attention. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's thrown rocks before against that metal roof, or you get a real resounding thump out of that. So it is what it is.
So that board with the screws on it, that
Right.
DNA came back as human, but wasn't there something else in there too that wasn't human?
Well, the story of the board, when it was shared with me, I sat up in my seat. I was really intrigued about this. Oh, this would be really amazing. How long ago did this happen? Well, it was several years, and the board had been just standing up against the cabin when it wasn't in use. So it's been exposed to the elements, to the UV light, to hot and cold, freezing temperatures, rain, snow, and so forth. I said, well, the chances of being, DNA persistent there is almost nil, if not. And but we looked at it. Now, what they did, it was actually at NYU. Todd Disotell's lab tested what we thought was blood, and it was so degraded. He even said it almost looked like paint. It was just or stain. There was just no cellular structure in there. And But Kurt Nelson, one of the members of the group up there, was he just didn't want to leave it any stone unturned. So he really went to work at it and wondered if there was something that was inhibiting the primers from picking up on any remnant DNA. And so he did a lot of purification of it and then successfully sequenced. The problem always, and he only sequenced 300 base pairs. That's the important point. And most people that may not mean much, but 300 bases. The DNA is made up of individual bases, so those are the codes. The codons consist of 3 bases, the ATCGs, nucleotides, and so 300 doesn't give you a whole lot, and especially when you're dealing with a creature that could have DNA that's almost 99% identical to us. Chimpanzees somewhere in the 96 to 98% range, depending on where you're in the genome. But especially in that circumstance, to be able to differentiate 2 species, you would want to have thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not whole genomic sample. And that's the problem, kind of what we're up against. So 300 is that's not looking through a knot hole at the baseball game. That's holding a curtain and punching a pinhole and trying to see the baseball game through that pinhole in the curtain. That's what we're looking at. And Kurt identified one substitution. One of those bases was replaced, and that particular substitution had not been documented for humans, but it was present in chimpanzees, he said. Well, that's intriguing, that's titillating, isn't it? That whatever this DNA came from had a variation that had been reported in chimps, not saying that it is a chimp, but it might be something a little more closely allied or that shares that same trait with a chimp as opposed to humans, or just not the humans we were looking at. And so, but when you've manipulated, when you've taken that sample and you've eluted it into a gel, and then you cut out the band and you dilute it again and you run it through another gel, you do that, the more you're manipulating that sample, the chances of contamination or just a physical alteration that causes a misread during the amplification is increased. And so that's why it's always kind of just sat there, hasn't gone beyond that documentary. It's not, building an argument on the point of the pyramid upside down instead of turning the base side down. There's just not a whole lot to work with there. So it was an intriguing experience, and the experiences were unrelated. I mean, were uncoupled, maybe related, but the rock throwing had no direct impact on the examination of and analysis of the screw board, so on. So it was interesting.
So do you think we're gonna find one soon?
Well, I can't put a time frame on it. I don't know. If you read Dr. Bindernagel's book, his second book, The Discovery of Bigfoot, he says we've already found it. It's been discovered. It just hasn't been acknowledged or recognized by mainstream science. And so, there's something to be said for that, whether it will be an actual specimen or whether it will be indirect evidence by means, if you want to call it that, by means of a DNA sample. I'm putting my eggs right now kind of in the basket of environmental DNA. I think that's the next step. If we just keep doing what we're doing, it's going to be purely by chance, by happenstance. Even if people are going out there in a disciplined, thoughtful, reasonable, equipped way, it's just the chance of finding that moving needle in the haystack. But if we go out with techniques for collecting environmental DNA from the habitat, from the environment, then it's kind of like casting a net much more broadly. And if there's trace and you have the means of collecting that data, then maybe we can get at it. We're still going to be up against this same problem with, as other DNA studies have experienced, and that is we're testing two genomes that are probably very, very similar to one another. And unless you find those rare distinguishing markers, what you get will look like human DNA. I mean, this is the issue. On those rare occasions we have gotten DNA from a sample in the past, and a test has been done, invariably it comes back as human. I mean, if it's not obviously a bear or something else, it comes back as human. So that means either it was contaminated through handling by the discoverer, by the witness, or two, that it was a misidentified human hair, right? Or the third possibility that doesn't get discussed, that doesn't get considered very much, is that you've only sampled enough to highlight those similarities to human, but not enough to identify the distinguishing characteristics that would identify it as Sasquatch. And I've discussed this over and over again with various geneticists, and they've concurred with my assessment of the situation there. That simple assessment. They said, you're right. You know, you would need to, if I were doing it, I would do X, Y, and Z. You know, I do all the mitochondrial genome. I would do at least 10 or 20 nuclear genes, if not a genomic sequence. So until we get to that point, till we have the labs that are willing to put in the effort and the financing to back it up, and reliable or worthy, let's put it that way, worthy samples that we think there's some positive potential for, or the eDNA approach. If but then it's all about selecting your sample locations. You can't just go out there and scoop up some dirt and say, well, let's see if Sasquatch has been in the neighborhood anytime recent. You know, if we find something like nests, this prospect of the discovery of these nests in the Olympic Peninsula is a really intriguing one, because you can find some fresh nests and collect samples of the soil in the bottom of those nests. That's the way to do it.
Well, the interesting thing to me would be if we could go to a place like Vancouver Island.
Right.
There have been many reports.
Yeah.
And that's like, if you could set up shop there and study it for a long period of time throughout the seasons,
yep,
with a crew that's paid and well taken care of, and
right,
of reasonable common sense, then I think that we would have a higher chance of finding one.
Oh, exactly. I mean, a sustained, systematic approach to it, and then bringing to bear these other techniques like eDNA and the other line of research that I would like to see people pursue that have the more knowledge and skills with their thumbs than I have. That is the improving drone technologies and miniaturization of thermal imaging cameras. And LiDAR is another possibility. These the ability that, and there are, I've been culling papers from literature. There are actually conservation studies that are using LiDAR to actually distinguish individual animals in the field, in the in the environment, if the terrain is mosaic or broken open enough. And even if it's not, I mean, that's the advantage of LiDAR, is that it penetrates. So if you've got the resolution to distinguish an animal that's potentially 600 to 1,000 pounds of mass, then there's a possibility of getting at it. And then you'd have to have a ground crew that's ready to ground proof the contacts that are made. But that would be a fascinating approach to the problem.
Well, I think in 2015, National Geographic did a piece about the spirit bears up in British Columbia.
Yeah.
And I believe that there were some new species of bears that were actually found on the expedition. So that's interesting because I don't know what bears weigh, but I mean they're very obvious in
Sure.
the woods. You know, I mean, it's just there's so much wilderness up there.
Right.
It's always been a part of native legend, but until recently, those types of bears were not in the spotlight.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, it's just a good example that still are discoveries to be made, and again, to think that we have all the answers is I think just extremely myopic. But yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on and discussing Sasquatch. It's been really interesting, very scientific. I'll have to go through it and research some of the terms and all that stuff because all my research has been mostly YouTube History Channel documentaries. I haven't actually read any challenging, readings about the subject yet. So
Sure, well, that's understandable.
but
Right.
definitely expanding my interest in the subject beyond just the wild monster in the forest. It's more of a scientific understanding of evolution and the origins of man and stuff like that. So it's more interesting than just something scary out in the woods.
Well, exactly, and I think that the acknowledgement of that context is really key to legitimizing the value of this research. And when it is just, as I said, lumped as just a topic of the tabloids or of so-called pseudoscience with no deference to the nature of the data and the nature of the question, biological, anthropological, ecological context, paleontological. I mean, bringing the scientific context to frame the question and understand, hey, there really could be something to this. It's a worthy question. So.
Well, I look forward to listening to this and doing further research on it. And again, thank you for your time, and
You bet.
hopefully you enjoy the rest of your summer out in Idaho.
All right. Thank you. Likewise.
Stay cool.
Will do.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.